The 39th Battalion was an infantry unit of the Australian Army. It was originally raised in February 1916 for service during World War I as part of First Australian Imperial Force, making up part of the 10th Brigade. It was attached to the 3rd Division and served on the Western Front in France and Belgium before being disbanded in March 1919. Following the reorganisation of the Australian Army in 1921, the battalion was raised again as a unit of the Citizens' Force, known as the Hawthorn Kew Regiment. In 1937, it was amalgamated with the 37th Battalion to become the 37th, 39th Battalion. Later it was delinked with the 37th and amalgamated with the 24th Battalion to form the 24th, 39th Battalion, before being raised again as a single unit in October 1941. During World War II the battalion was sent to New Guinea in 1942, and between July and August of that year the unit was heavily engaged in the defense of the Kokoda Trail, during which time they fought several desperate actions against the Japanese as they attempted to hold out until further reinforcements could be brought up from Port Moresby. Such was their involvement in the battle that by the time they were withdrawn they could only muster 32 men, and following its return to Australia, the unit was disbanded in early July 1943. History. World War I. Formation. The 39th Battalion was first formed on the 21st of February 1916 at the Ballarat Showgrounds in Victoria for service during World War I, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rankin. The battalion was raised as part of an expansion of the First Australian Imperial Force that took place at the conclusion of the Gallipoli campaign. The majority of the battalion's recruits came from the Western District of Victoria, and together with the 37th, 38th and 40th Battalions, it formed the 10th Brigade, which was part of the 3rd Division. Following a brief period of training in Ballarat, the 39th Battalion marched through Melbourne on the 15th of May as the city farewelled the unit, and they subsequently embarked upon HMAT Ascanius on the 27th of May, 1916, bound for the United Kingdom. Sailing via Cape Town, the battalion landed at Plymouth on the 18th of July 1916, and moved by train to Amesbury, before marching to Larkhill on Salisbury Plain, where they undertook a period of 4 months training before being sent to France in November. After completing the Channel crossing on 23-24 November, they landed at Le Havre and moved to the front by train. On the night of the 10th of December, the battalion took its place in the trenches along the Western Front, relieving its sister battalion, the 37th, around Hoop Lines in the Armentières sector. They remained at the front for the next week, as part of their introduction to trench warfare, during which time the battalion repelled a small German raid and sent out patrols into no man's land. Western Front. After having endured a long winter in Flanders, serving in mainly a defensive role, the battalion's first major engagement came at Messines in Belgium in early June 1917. The battle began badly for the 39th, near Ploegsteert Corner. During the march to the line of departure, the battalion suffered a high number of casualties following a German gas attack, which subsequently resulted the 39th only being able to muster about a third of its manpower for the attack, amounting to an assault force of only 120 men. Despite this, the 39th was quickly reorganized into a single wave, and attacking on the 10th Brigade's right, it subsequently overcame the initial German opposition facing them, and then, during the second phase of the battle, advanced south of Douvres, on the southern edge of the Messines Ridge. It was involved in further fighting north of Grey Farm, where they were initially held up by German machine gun fire, but after this was overcome they continued to advance to the final objective, eventually digging in 100 yards beyond the farm. having managed to capture all of its objectives. Later, in October, the 39th Battalion took part in two other major attacks in that same sector, firstly at Broodside and then at Passchendaele, the first of which was a brilliant success while the second was a disastrous failure. During the fighting around Broodside on the 4th of October, the 39th formed the third wave of the 10th Brigade's attack, which went in around 6 a.m. Following up the 37th and 38th Battalions, they advanced against strongly held pillboxes towards the Gravenstaffel switch. After digging in, a party from the 39th joined the 40th Battalion as it launched the final wave in the brigade's attack. As the 40th came up against stiff opposition, more men from the 39th were pushed forward and the objective was finally secured around 11 a.m. After the battle, the 39th remained in the line until the 6th of October, when it was withdrawn back to Moorbeek for reorganization and rest. A couple of days later, the battalion was recommitted to the fighting and ordered to advance towards Passchendaele Ridge, attacking on the morning of the 12th of October despite heavy rain the previous evening. In the heavy fighting that followed, the battalion managed to secure its first objective, but was forced to withdraw when its flanks became threatened as neighboring units had been unable to advance with them through the thick mud. Over the course of the next 5 months, the 39th Battalion rotated between the front line and rear areas, holding the line in Belgium throughout winter. In the spring of 1918, when the German army launched its last effort at victory, known as the Spring Offensive, the 39th was among the many Australian battalions that were hurriedly moved south to France in order to stem the tide of the German onslaught towards Amiens, fighting a series of defensive actions in the Somme between late March and early June, when the Allies launched their own offensive, the 100 Days Offensive. On the 8th of August 1918, the battalion, along with the rest of the 10th Brigade, was serving as the divisional reserve, and they did not participate in the advance that has since become known as one of the greatest days for the Allies on the Western Front. On the 10th of August, the battalion was committed to battle once more, undertaking an attack on the village of Proit, but this attack was ill-conceived and ultimately failed. Despite this, the battalion remained in the line throughout August and early September as the 3rd Division advanced through the Somme Valley. The battalion undertook its last major action of the war at the end of September 1918 when, serving alongside the Americans, they breached parts of the Hindenburg Line along the St. Quentin Canal. During this final battle, the battalion's long-serving commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Henderson, who had taken command in February 1917 before the battalion's first major battle, was killed in action. Late on the 2nd of October, while around Guillemont Crescent, the 39th was relieved and the battalion was removed from the line to undertake training and reorganization. In the middle of October, the 39th was bolstered by a company of reinforcements from the 37th, which had been disbanded to help make up losses in the other 10th Brigade units. Nevertheless, the 39th did not see action again and they were still at the rear when the armistice was declared on the 11th of November 1918. With the fighting over, the process of demobilization began and slowly the men began marching out for repatriation to Australia. Finally, in March 1919, the 39th Battalion was disbanded. At this point, the battalion's remaining personnel were amalgamated with other units to form the 10th Demobilization Regiment, with the last of its soldiers returning to Australia in May. During During the course of the war, the 39th Battalion suffered 405 men killed, while a further 1,637 were wounded. Members of the battalion received the following decorations: 1 member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 14 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 14 Military Crosses, 78 Military Medals with 3 bars, and 22 mentions in dispatches. For their involvement in the fighting on the Western Front, the 39th Battalion were awarded 14 battle honours in 1927. Interwar years. At the end of World War I, there was a wholesale disbandment of units of the Australian Army as the wartime army was disbanded and its personnel demobilised. In 1921, it was decided that there was a need to raise a part-time military force, known as the Citizens' Force, which would take responsibility for the defence of the Australian mainland. This force was organised along the same lines of the First AIF, and the units raised kept the same numerical designation as the First AIF battalions. The AIF ceased to exist officially on the 1st of April 1921, and the Citizens' Force was reorganised the following month on the 1st of May, adopting the numerical designations and structures of the AIF. As a part of this, the 39th Battalion was raised in 1921 in Melbourne. Upon formation, the battalion was attached to the 10th Brigade, 3rd Division, and a battalion drew personnel from the 22nd and 24th Infantry Regiments and the 29th Light Horse. In 1927, territorial designations were adopted and the battalion assumed the title of the Hawthorn Regiment. 3 years later, this was changed to the Hawthorn Kew Regiment. It assumed the motto of Factus non verbis in 1927. Initially, the battalion was kept up to strength with volunteers and men serving under the terms of the compulsory training scheme, but in 1929 the scheme was suspended by the newly elected Scullin Labour government and the citizen forces were renamed the militia. The combination of the end to compulsory training and the financial hardships of the Great Depression meant that there were few volunteers available. His men could not risk losing their jobs to undertake training, and as a result throughout the 1930s a number of units were amalgamated or disbanded, as the size of the army was reduced. In 1937, the 39th Battalion was merged with the 37th Battalion, before later being delinked with the 37th and being amalgamated with the 24th Battalion, becoming the 24th 39th Battalion. An alliance with the Dorsetshire Regiment was approved in 1930. World War II. Formation. On the 1st of October 1941, the Australian Military Board issued an order re-raising the 39th Battalion as a single battalion of the Australian Military Forces, as militiamen were called up for national service. The intent was to raise the battalion to relieve the Queensland-based 49th Battalion, which was serving as a garrison force around Port Moresby, and from the outset the battalion was formed from men who were transferred from a variety of infantry and light horse units, including the 24th 39th Battalion that had been deployed at Nagambie Road in Seymour, Victoria, as well as elements from the militia 2nd Cavalry and 3rd and 4th Infantry Divisions. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Conran became the battalion's new commanding officer, having previously served with the 23rd Battalion during World War I, and in the Citizens' Military Force after the war. The battalion headquarters was opened at Darley Camp, near Bacchus Marsh, and by the 8th of October 1941, a nucleus of officers and senior non-commissioned officers, many of whom had experience from World War I, had prepared the battalion for the arrival of the soldiers or other ranks that would bring it up to its required establishment. On the 10th of October 1941, The first draft of 9 officers and 523 men from the 3rd Infantry Division assembled at Caulfield Racecourse Transit Camp and were transported by rail to Darley Camp. The following day numbers increased further with the arrival of another 7 officers and 400 men from the 2nd Cavalry and 4th Infantry Divisions. Later, in June 1942, after it had arrived in New Guinea, the battalion's strength was bolstered with the transfer of 16 officers from the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, including a new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Owen. On the 21st of November 1941, the 39th Battalion paraded through the streets of Melbourne with weapons. It had taken 52 days to form the battalion, and while the battalion had still been under strength, they were declared ready for training. In the end, however, as events in the Pacific unfolded, this training was cut short and the battalion was only able to undertake one training exercise in this time. This exercise was codenamed the Battle of Corangamite and was conducted in the Victorian Western District at the end of October, 2 days after the Japanese attack on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor and the British in Malaya. On the 9th of December 1941, the battalion was ordered to prepare to move, as it was mobilized for war service. The threat of invasion by the Japanese changed the strategic situation and withered the planning forecasts of the Australian High Command. As such, instead of relieving the 49th Battalion, the 39th was combined with the 49th and the New South Wales-based 53rd Battalion to form the 30th Brigade, and plans were made for the entire formation to deploy to New Guinea. Christmas Day 1941 was spent in camp, before the 39th Battalion was loaded onto 2 trains the following day for a rapid move north. One train went straight to Albury and the other departed from Spencer Street Station, Melbourne, 2 hours later. Both trains arrived in Sydney at 10:40 hours. On the 27th of December 1941, the battalion then detrained and moved by ferry to Woolloomooloo Wharf, where the 1,068 officers, NCOs and men of the battalion boarded the passenger ship the Aquitania bound for New Guinea, Kokoda Track. Initially upon their arrival in New Guinea in January 1942, the 39th Battalion was used to defend the airfield at 7 Mile Aerodrome, near Port Moresby, and to carry out various other garrison tasks such as building defences and unloading stores at the wharf. In May 1942, the battalion's commanding officer, Conran, was deemed medically unfit for service, and on the 24th of May he relinquished command. In June 1942, as the military situation in New Guinea deteriorated further, the battalion received orders to move up the Kokoda Track in order to act as a blocking force against the possibility of a Japanese advance overland from the north. In order to counter this threat, Maroubra Force, composed of troops the 39th Battalion and the Papuan Infantry Battalion, were sent to Kokoda, arriving there on the 15th of July. This move proved prescient as a large Japanese force landed at Ghana only a week later, and they quickly began to move inland towards Kokoda. The first clash occurred at Awala on the 23rd of July, when a platoon from B Company, under the command of Captain Sam Templeton, having destroyed the footbridge over the Kumusi River, engaged the Japanese on the far side of the river. The Australians were forced to withdraw, however, when hundreds of Japanese Marines began crossing the river under a barrage of mortar and machine gun fire. They withdrew only a few miles before Templeton set up a successful ambush for the advancing Japanese on the banks of the Garari Creek. Nevertheless, they were forced back further towards the high ground at Oivi, where they attempted to make a stand while Templeton tried to make contact with battalion headquarters and the rest of the battalion, who were spread out further along the track. In order to get more reinforcements, On the evening of the 29th of July, the Japanese attacked the main position Kokoda. There were only 80 men from B Company left at that time, and armed only with small arms and a few Bren light machine guns. They were no match for the assaulting Japanese. Casualties on both sides were high as the Australians resorted to hand-to-hand combat, and a battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Owen, who had flown in to take over the battalion following Templeton's death, was killed while organizing the withdrawal. It became clear that Kokoda was lost, and the following morning, under the cover of a dense mist, with the PIB's commanding officer, Major William Watson, assuming temporary command, the survivors abandoned the position and fell back towards the village of Deniki, a mile or so back along the Kokoda track towards Ishurava. The remnants of B Company regrouped at Deniki, but they were in a bad state, and when on the 4th of August Major Alan Cameron, Brigade Major of the 30th Brigade, arrived to take command of Marlborough Force. Most of them were sent back to Ishurava in disgrace, as he was under the mistaken belief that they had run away from the fighting. Nevertheless, on the 8th of August the rest of the 39th Battalion, now without the only troops who had any experience fighting the Japanese, launched a counterattack at Kokoda. They managed to secure one side of the airfield, but due to the close proximity of the Japanese on the other side, relief aircraft were unable to land, and short of food and ammunition, they were forced to fall back to Deniki once again after almost 2 days of fighting. They eventually managed to halt the Japanese advance, and on the 14th of August Marlborough Force fell back to Ishurava. At this point the fighting ceased for almost 2 weeks, and during this time the 39th was joined by the 53rd and the 30th Brigade headquarters, and Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor arrived from Iloilo to take command. Reaching the battalion at Ishurava on the 16th of August, he subsequently began organizing the battalion's defense of Ishurava. On the 23rd of August, Brigadier Arnold Potts took over command of Marlborough Force, and further reinforcements arrived as first the 2 14th, 2 16th and later the 2 27th battalions from the 7th Division's 21st Brigade also reached the area. Despite this, the situation remained bleak, as the supply issue was becoming a serious problem for the Australians, and the reinforcements that had arrived were also in a state of disarray, having been committed to the battle in a piecemeal fashion and suffering badly from hunger and disease. Although the Japanese were experiencing similar problems in relation to supplies, they began their advance once again on the 26th of August, and despite several rugged defensive actions, the Australians were forced back again. First to Eora Creek on the 30th of August, then Templeton's Crossing on the 2nd of September, and finally to a foggy 3 days later. Exhausted from their efforts and no longer able to be considered an effective fighting force, the 39th was relieved and sent down the track to Koitiki to rest. They had done the job that was required of them, having stalled the Japanese advance in order to allow reinforcements to be brought up. These reinforcements came in the shape of the 25th Brigade, comprising the 225th, 231st Silverstone and 233rd Road battalions. Bitter fighting ensued, and the Australians withdrew once again on the 17th of September, this time to Imita Ridge. However, the Japanese had reached the limit, and on the 24th of September began to withdraw. By the 2nd of November, Kokoda was back in Australian hands. Fighting around Ghana and disbandment following the 39th Battalion's withdrawal from the line in September 1942. They spent a month at Koitiki before being sent back to Port Moresby in mid-October, where they were detailed to prepare defensive positions. In November, they were attached to the 21st Brigade. and throughout December the 39th Battalion was involved in further fighting as the brigade fought around Ghana. During this time the 39th suffered heavy casualties, but the fighting continued, and having captured the Ghana mission, the battalion moved to the Sanananda track on the 21st of December, taking up a forward position at Huggins's roadblock. In the new year the battalion was withdrawn to Soputa and returned to the 30th Brigade. They had suffered heavy casualties, and in January 1943, when it was flown back to Port Moresby, it had a frontage of only 7 officers and 25 men. In February, the 39th was ordered to prepare for operations in the war area in anticipation of a further Japanese attack. But this attack did not eventuate, and on the 12th of March the 39th Battalion embarked for the return journey to Australia. Following the 39th Battalion's return to Australia, the men were given a period of leave before 30th Brigade was reconstituted on the Atherton tablelands in Queensland. Initially, the plan was to reorganize the brigade and rebuild it prior to returning it to New Guinea. But in July it was decided that the 30th Brigade, along with its component battalions, the 39th, 49th, and 3rd Battalions, would be disbanded and used to reinforce the 6th Division, with reinforcements being sent to the 16th and 19th Brigades. This came into effect on the 3rd of July 1943, and as a result of this decision, the militiamen that had been called up for service were transferred to the 36th Battalion, a militia battalion from New South Wales, while those who had volunteered for overseas service were sent to the 2nd Battalion. Both of these units later saw further service in New Guinea. At the end of the battalion's involvement in the fighting in New Guinea, 1,666 men had served in its ranks. The battalion suffered 403 combat casualties, which consisted of 118 killed in action, 13 died of wounds, 5 died other causes, and 266 wounded in action. Illness and disease also took a heavy toll, and as a result, after 6 months of combat, the 39th Battalion's muster roll was only 7 officers and 25 other ranks. For the service during World War II, members of the 39th Battalion received the following decorations: 2 MBEs, 1 DSO, 4 DCMs, 7 MCs, 10 MMs, 1 U.S. Distinguished Service Cross, and 11 MIDs. The 39th received 8 battle honours for the war in 1961. It was the only Australian unit to receive the Kokoda Trail Battle Honour. Battle Honours. The 39th Battalion received the following battle honours: World War I, Messines 1917, Ypres 1917, Polygon Wood, Broadside, Po El Capel, Passchendaele, Somme 1918, Ancre 1918, Amiens, Albert 1918, Mont Saint-Quentin, Hindenburg Line, St. Quentin Canal, France and Flanders 1916–18. World War II. Southwest Pacific 1942–43, Kokoda Trail, Kokoda Deniki, Ishurava, Eora Creek, Templeton's Crossing I, Boonagona, Sanananda Road, Amberga River. Commanding Officers. World War I, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rankin, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Henderson, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Thomas Patterson. World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Marcel Conran, Lieutenant Colonel William Taylor Owen, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Hyacinth Honor. Legacy. Since the end of the war, the 39th Battalion's involvement in the fighting around Kokoda has become a significant part of the narrative surrounding the Anzac legend and Australia's emergence as a modern nation. The battalion's actions were first shown in Damien Perra's 1942 film Kokoda Frontline, and more recently in the 2006 Australian movie Kokoda, which was based partly directly on Victor Austin's to Kokoda and beyond. After the war, when Australia's part-time military forces were reformed in 1948, while many battalions that had been disbanded during the war were re-raised, the 39th was not. On 8 August 2006, the Australian Army raised the 39th Battalion, adopting the 39th's numerical designation in order to perpetuate them on the order of battle. During the ceremony that was held at the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, the Governor-General, Major General Michael Jeffrey, described the 39th Battalion as some of Australia's most gallant soldiers, stating that the Australian nation was indebted to them for the heroic service